Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into a time machine, not to a grand, heroic battlefield or a dramatic coronation, but into the quiet chambers and bustling markets of the medieval world. I want you to imagine the flicker of a tallow candle, the scratch of rough wool against your skin, and the scent of wood smoke and unwashed bodies hanging in the cold, damp air. You're not a knight or a queen, you're just a person, living an ordinary life in an extraordinary time. And you're about to discover that even the most mundane parts of your existence, like how you look in the morning, were defined by a whole different set of rules. This is the stuff they don't put in the textbooks. The little, often baffling details that tell us so much about what it was really like. Trust me, you probably wouldn't survive a week trying to get ready by medieval beauty standards. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time down in the comments. It's always wild to see where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins with the paradox of medieval beauty, the obsession with a pale, almost ethereal complexion. Think of the portraits you've seen of medieval ladies. Their skin is often luminous, a startling white against a backdrop of rich fabrics. This wasn't just a stylistic choice by the painters, it was a deeply ingrained cultural ideal. Paleness was the ultimate signifier of wealth and status. It meant you didn't have to toil in the fields under the harsh sun. You were a person of leisure, of indoor pursuits, of refinement. A farmer's wife, a peasant girl, would have a ruddy, wind-chapped face and calloused hands, a direct result of her daily labour. So, if you were a noblewoman, your paleness was a constant, unspoken advertisement of your family's fortune. It was a status symbol, an economic indicator you wore on your face. You were, in effect, a walking, breathing billboard for your family's success. It was also seen as a sign of purity and virtue. The delicate, untainted skin was often linked to a woman's innocence and piety, a reflection of her inner goodness. This is one of those quirks of history where a purely aesthetic preference becomes entangled with moral and religious beliefs. Historians still argue whether this obsession with paleness was a direct reaction to the common person's sun-kissed skin or if it had roots in ancient Roman and Greek ideals of beauty. What we do know for sure is that medieval people took this ideal very, very seriously. They used all sorts of methods, from the surprisingly gentle to the outright dangerous, to achieve that perfect ghostly pallor. You can imagine the scene in a lady's chamber, a maid carefully applying a paste, perhaps made from egg whites and flour, to her mistress's face. A concoction meant to tighten the skin and give it a temporary glow. This wasn't some quick, 10-minute routine. It was a meticulous process, a daily ritual to maintain the illusion of a life free from labour. Of course, a simple flour paste was just the start. The real danger, and the quirky tidbit for this section, lies in some of the more extreme methods. To achieve the whitest possible skin, some women would even bleed themselves. The belief was that by draining some of the blood, the skin would become visibly paler. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? Voluntarily losing blood, probably to a barber surgeon who saw this as a perfectly legitimate service, all for the sake of a fashionable complexion. It's a perfect example of how far people will go for beauty, regardless of the time period, and this isn't even the weirdest or most dangerous thing they'll do, believe me. So, as you drift off, just think about the lengths you would go to for a little bit of social status, a little bit of that pale glow, and be glad you can just go to the store and get some foundation instead of a phlebotomist. So you've decided that a simple egg white mask isn't cutting it. You want that ultimate, high-status glow, that luminous paleness that screams, "I haven't seen the sun in a decade." This is where things get truly gnarly. The path to a beautiful complexion was paved with powders, potions, and a whole lot of peril. The most sought-after ingredient for this luminous look was lead. Yes, you heard that right. Lead. It was called ceruse, a white lead pigment, and it was the foundation of choice for a medieval noblewoman. Now, if you're a fan of basic chemistry, you know lead is a neurotoxin. But back then, this was seen as a miracle substance. It had fantastic staying power, gave a brilliant white finish, and covered up all those little blemishes that even a perfectly pale face couldn't hide. It was the original heavy-duty concealer, and it came with a hefty, and often deadly, price tag. You would apply this ceruse as a paste, a thick, chalky layer on your face, neck, and chest. The effect was immediate and dramatic. You were instantly transformed into a porcelain doll. You were a walking work of art, a living testament to your family's wealth. But over time, the lead would begin its insidious work. It would seep into your skin, causing it to corrode and grey. The very substance meant to make you beautiful would, ironically, start to disfigure you. Your skin would become discolored, your hair would start to fall out, and you'd likely suffer from a whole host of neurological problems, like tremors, memory loss, and a general feeling of malaise. It's like using a beauty product that slowly but surely eats away at your face and your mind. You'd need more and more ceruse to cover up the damage caused by the last application, a vicious cycle that, for many, had no happy ending. Historians still argue whether medieval women were fully aware of the toxic properties of lead. While they certainly knew it caused problems, they could see their skin turning grey and their health deteriorating, they often attributed these ailments to other causes, like a bad humour or a curse. There was no understanding of chemical toxicity as we know it today. They were simply trying to be beautiful, and they were willing to risk a lot for it. This isn't just about women, either. Men, especially those in the nobility, also used ceruse and other lead-based cosmetics to appear youthful and healthy. The desire for a fair complexion crossed gender lines, proving that vanity is a truly equal opportunity obsession. And for a quirky tidbit, let's talk about the Roman influence. Remember that they were the first to really get into lead makeup? Well, some medieval recipes for ceruse were simply a repackaging of ancient Roman cosmetic formulas, passed down through generations. But here's the interesting part. Some of these recipes included a step where the lead was mixed with vinegar and then left to ferment in a sealed jar for several weeks. The resulting substance was supposedly a purer, more potent form of the whitening agent. The idea of letting your beauty products rot in a jar with lead and vinegar is, frankly, a little unhinged, but it shows the lengths to which people would go. And to be fair, they didn't have a lot of options. You couldn't just pop down to the pharmacy for some non-toxic moisturizer. You had to make do with what you had, so, if you weren't careful, your beauty routine could literally kill you. It puts that 5-step skincare regimen you use today into a whole new perspective, doesn't it? Just think about that as you get ready for bed. Your skin is probably breathing a sigh of relief, with your face now a pristine, pale canvas. You'd turn your attention to your crowning glory, your hair. And if you were truly on the cutting edge of medieval fashion, your hair was, without question, blonde. This wasn't just a passing fad, it was another powerful symbol of class and purity, deeply intertwined with the pale skin ideal. Blonde hair was rare in many parts of Europe, making it a coveted feature, a genetic lottery ticket that most people didn't win. For a noblewoman, having blonde hair meant you were a living embodiment of the ideals of beauty, perhaps even a reflection of angelic purity, as many depictions of angels and saints showed them with light, flowing locks. It was a stark contrast to the dark, coarse hair of the common folk, whose daily life often involved sun exposure that would naturally lighten their hair in a less controlled or less desirable way. But what do you do if you're born with a less than perfect shade of brown or black? You fake it. Of course. The medieval equivalent of a box of hair dye wasn't sitting on a shelf at the market. Instead, you would turn to a fascinating and sometimes stomach-churning array of home-brewed concoctions. One of the most popular, and perhaps least offensive, was a paste made from saffron, a very expensive spice, and various herbs. Saffron would impart a yellow-orange hue to the hair, and while it might not have been a natural-looking blonde, it was the best you could do. You'd paint this mixture onto your hair, sit out in the sun for hours to let the mixture work its magic, and hope for the best. It's like a medieval version of DIY highlights, only a lot more messy and a lot less precise. Now, for the quirky and frankly gross tidbit, some people, in their desperate quest for the perfect blonde, would turn to an ingredient that was readily available and, well, free: urine. The belief was that urine had bleaching properties, and people would rinse their hair in it, hoping to lighten their locks. I know, I know, it's a hard image to shake. But remember, this was a time when medical and cosmetic knowledge was based on folk remedies and old wives' tales, not scientific research. If something seemed like it might work, people tried it. It shows the sheer determination and, frankly, lack of other options for someone who desperately wanted to be beautiful. Historians still argue whether the urine method was widespread or confined to fringe practices, but the fact that it was even mentioned in some of the surviving texts on beauty and hygiene suggests it was, at the very least, a known, if not popular, option. The quest for beauty was an unregulated market, and people would often turn to whatever they had access to, no matter how strange or unpleasant. This desire for blonde hair was so strong that some men, too, would dye their hair and beards to fit the fashionable ideal. This was a time when a well-groomed, light-coloured beard could be as much a statement of status as a noblewoman's paleness. The colour of your hair wasn't just a matter of personal taste, it was a societal stamp, a signifier that told the world exactly who you were and, more importantly, who you were not. As you picture this, perhaps with a slight shudder, remember that even the most beautiful people in history had to go through some pretty gross stuff just to look the part. With your face a luminous pale and your hair a shimmering blonde, you'd now turn your attention to a feature you probably never think about: your forehead. In the medieval era, a high, rounded forehead was all the rage, a subtle but significant marker of beauty and intellect. A high forehead, often accentuated by a tightly pulled-back hairline, was seen as a sign of intelligence and breeding. It was a blank canvas, a frame for a perfect, pale face, and it drew the eye upwards to the very crown of the head. It was a style that spoke of sophistication and a world far removed from the dirt and toil of the fields. For a woman, it was also a sign of her virginity and innocence. As a high forehead was seen as a symbol of purity, it was a look that communicated, without a single word, that you were a person of high standing, with a mind as clear and unblemished as your skin. To achieve this ideal, women went to some truly extreme lengths. The most common method was to pluck or shave the hair at the temples and along the forehead, pushing the hairline back to create a much larger forehead. This wasn't a quick little waxing session, it was a painful, meticulous process, often done with tweezers or even by hand, one hair at a time. This was a daily ritual for many noble women, a small but significant act of self-torture in the name of beauty. They would also shave their eyebrows, or pluck them down to a thin, barely there line, to further emphasize the height of their foreheads. The look was so extreme that in some paintings, you'll see women with what looks like a completely bald forehead, a testament to just how dedicated they were to this trend. Now, for a quirky tidbit, in some cases, women would even use a razor to shave their eyebrows and hairline. This was a particularly dangerous practice, as a slip of the hand could lead to a nasty cut or a permanently scarred face. But the allure of the high forehead was so strong that it was a risk many were willing to take. And it wasn't just the hairline they were messing with. Some women would even pluck their eyelashes, believing that a wide-eyed, open look was more beautiful. It's a bit of a head-scratcher when you think about it, a look that, to our modern eyes, might seem a little unsettling, was considered the pinnacle of elegance and beauty back then. Historians still argue whether this trend was a conscious rejection of the peasant class's full, natural hair, or if it was simply a fashion that took hold and became the norm. What we do know is that it was a look that defined the medieval aesthetic, a subtle but powerful statement that separated the noble from the commoner. And it wasn't just about the hair itself. The high forehead was a canvas for other beauty practices, like the application of ceruse or other whitening agents. The entire face was a carefully constructed work of art, with every feature meticulously shaped and styled to fit the prevailing ideal. So, as you drift off, just think about the lengths you would go to for a fashion trend. Would you pluck your hairline back to your crown? I'm guessing not. But for a medieval woman, it was just another part of the daily grind of being beautiful, with your pale, high forehead look now perfectly in place. There was one more piece to the puzzle, one more crucial detail to get right: your eyes. The ideal medieval gaze was large, wide, and luminous, a look that conveyed a sense of childlike innocence and spiritual depth. And like everything else in the medieval beauty routine, This look was not achieved naturally. To get those big, doe-like eyes, women would use a substance called Belladonna, or more ominously, deadly nightshade. This plant, with its small, dark berries, was a potent poison, but its extract had a very specific and highly sought-after effect. It dilated the pupils, so you would take a small amount of belladonna extract and, with a tiny brush or a dropper, carefully apply it to your eyes. The effect was almost immediate. Your pupils would widen, creating the illusion of huge, dark eyes that were captivating and mysterious. It was a look that was seen as incredibly alluring and beautiful. The name Belladonna literally means beautiful lady in Italian, a testament to how highly this effect was prized. It was a look that made you seem more awake, more alert, and, some believed, more emotionally expressive. It was a cosmetic choice that gave you a certain gaze, one that could hold the attention of a room and make you feel like the most beautiful person in it. But the side effects were less than beautiful. The belladonna would not only dilate your pupils, but it would also cause blurred vision, sensitivity to light, and in larger doses, hallucinations, increased heart rate, and even death. It's a terrifying thought. You're willing to risk going blind or even dying just to make your eyes look a little bigger. The line between a cosmetic and a poison was incredibly thin, and for many women, it was a line they were willing to cross every day. The look was so popular that people would often just live with the blurry vision and the sensitivity to light. A small price to pay for what they believed was the pinnacle of beauty. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the cultural context. The use of belladonna wasn't just about looking good, it was also tied to the spiritual and mystical beliefs of the time. The dilated pupils were sometimes seen as a sign of a person's heightened sensitivity, their ability to perceive things beyond the normal, mortal realm. It was a look that could be interpreted as both beautiful and a little bit dangerous, a sign of a woman with a certain kind of power. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of belladonna was a conscious effort to mimic this mystical look, or if it was just a happy accident that its side effects aligned with a cultural ideal. What we do know is that it was a common practice, and one that, for all its dangers, was a part of many women's daily routines. So, as you're snuggled up in your bed, just remember that the path to beauty in the medieval world was fraught with peril. It wasn't about a little bit of mascara or some eyeliner. It was about using a deadly plant to make your eyes look big. It puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Just be glad that your eyeliner is, not a poison, with your face and hair meticulously crafted. You would turn your attention to your physique. And this is where the medieval ideal of beauty takes a sharp turn away from our modern sensibilities. While today's media often pushes for a lean, toned, and sometimes skeletal figure, the medieval ideal was the polar opposite. In this world, Plump was beautiful. A full, rounded body with soft curves and a well-fed appearance was a powerful and public symbol of wealth, health, and fertility. Think about it from a purely practical standpoint. The medieval era was a time of frequent famine, disease, and hardship. Food was not a guarantee for the vast majority of the population, so, if you were a noblewoman, a plump figure was the ultimate flex. It meant you had access to a steady supply of rich foods, meats, breads, and fine wines. You didn't have to worry about where your next meal was coming from. You were a living, breathing testament to your family's prosperity, and a stark contrast to the gaunt, sinewy figures of the common folk who toiled in the fields with little to eat. This was a direct, visual representation of the social hierarchy. The bigger you were, the more important you seemed. And it wasn't just about wealth, it was also about health and fertility. A woman with a full figure was seen as more likely to bear strong, healthy children in a time of high infant mortality and a constant need for heirs. This was a highly desirable trait. It wasn't just about looking good, it was about looking like a good wife and mother, a woman who could carry a lineage forward. It was a beauty standard with a very clear, biological purpose. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the fashion that supported this look. While we think of medieval clothing as loose and flowing, some garments were designed to emphasize and even exaggerate a full figure. Ladies' dresses often had high waists that cinched just under the bust, allowing the fabric to fall in voluminous folds over a plump belly and hips. They would sometimes even use padding to enhance their curves, creating the illusion of a more robust figure than they might have naturally had. It was the medieval version of a padded bra. only for your stomach and hips. Historians still argue whether the desire for plumpness was an entirely conscious rejection of the peasant's body, or if it was an ideal that simply evolved out of a society obsessed with food and survival. What is clear is that the medieval perception of a beautiful body was a radical departure from what we consider beautiful today. It was a world where a double chin was a sign of abundance, not a source of shame, a world where a protruding belly was a mark of status, not something to be sucked in and hidden. So as you get comfortable tonight, just remember that every era has its own definition of beauty, and sometimes those definitions can be so different that they feel like they belong to a whole different species. So, you're plump and proud, a true vision of medieval beauty. But the journey to a perfect silhouette wasn't over. While the ideal was a soft, rounded figure, it was also one that had a specific, often painful, shape. This is where we get into the world of corsetry and tight lacing. The goal wasn't to achieve an impossibly small waist, as was the case in later centuries, but rather to create a smooth, cone-like torso that pushed the breasts upward and created a strong, upright posture. This was a fashion statement, yes, but it was also a social one. A straight back and a prominent chest were signs of a lady of leisure who didn't have to slouch over a loom or a wash basin. The garments used for this were often called stays or bodies. They were typically made of heavy linen or canvas, reinforced with reeds, wood, or even whalebone, and they were laced up the back with cords or ribbons. The lacing wasn't just for show, it was a way to mold the body into the desired shape. And yes, it was a very tight squeeze. The lacing could be so constricting that it would make breathing difficult. A practice that often led to fainting spells. This wasn't necessarily seen as a bad thing, either. In fact, swooning was often romanticized, a sign of a delicate and sensitive nature, a hallmark of true femininity. It was a physical manifestation of a woman's fragility and her elevated, refined status. Now for a quirky tidbit. In some cases, the stays were so rigid that they were believed to be able to correct a crooked spine or bad posture. It was a kind of a medieval orthotic, a painful but supposedly necessary device to ensure a lady's back was as straight as her lineage. Of course, the reality was that these stays often did more harm than good, restricting blood flow and causing damage to internal organs. But the pressure to conform to this silhouette was immense, and a little bit of physical discomfort was seen as a small price to pay for social acceptance and a chance at a good marriage. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of these garments was to create a specific shape or to simply support the heavy, multi-layered dresses that were fashionable at the time. What we do know is that they were a significant part of a noblewoman's daily life. A sartorial corset that was both a symbol of beauty and a tool of social control. The act of being laced into your stays was a ritual, a daily reminder of your place in society and the expectations that came with it. And it wasn't just for women. Some men also wore forms of stays to create a more imposing than broad-shouldered look. The pressure to conform to a specific body type was a universal concern, a constant thread that runs through history, from the medieval court to the modern-day gym. So, as you drift off to sleep, just remember that the next time you get a cramp, at least it's not from a whalebone corset, with your body shaped and supported. Your attention would move to a surprisingly low-priority feature for the medieval person, your smile. Today, we're obsessed with pearly whites, spending billions on whitening kits, braces, and veneers. But in the medieval world, the attitude towards teeth was, shall we say, a bit more relaxed. A perfect, gleaming smile was not a marker of beauty or status. In fact, a full set of teeth was simply a sign of good health and good fortune. The main goal wasn't to whiten them, but to simply keep them from falling out. Dental hygiene as we know it was virtually non-existent. People didn't brush their teeth twice a day with toothpaste and a modern toothbrush. Instead, they relied on a mix of folk remedies and occasional cleaning. One of the most common methods was to chew on sticks or herbs that had a slightly abrasive texture, like a piece of hazelwood or the bark of a willow tree. These acted as a kind of natural toothbrush, scraping away some of the surface gunk. They would also use a linen cloth to rub their teeth and gums, a practice that was probably more effective at stimulating the gums than it was at actually cleaning the teeth. But for our quirky tidbit, let's talk about some of the more creative solutions. Some people would rub their teeth with a concoction made from wine vinegar and various spices. The belief was that the acidic vinegar would whiten the teeth, and the spices would freshen the breath. The reality was that the vinegar likely did more harm than good, eroding the enamel over time. The medieval person was, in a sense, unknowingly drinking a very slow and painful acid bath for their teeth. Another strange tidbit: some people believed that a person's temperament could be discerned by the state of their teeth. A set of strong, healthy teeth was seen as a sign of a strong, healthy constitution, while a set of yellowed, crooked teeth was sometimes linked to a more melancholic or sickly disposition. Historians still argue whether this nonchalant attitude towards teeth was due to a lack of knowledge or if it was simply a cultural indifference. What we do know is that a healthy set of teeth was a luxury, a sign of a life free from poverty and poor nutrition. Cavities and tooth decay were common. And for most people, a toothache was a common and painful part of life. There was no dentist to go to, no root canal to save a tooth. The only option was often extraction, a painful and brutal process that was usually done by a barber surgeon. So, as you drift off, just think about your last trip to the dentist and be glad that you live in an era where a beautiful smile is a choice, not just a matter of dumb luck. With your pale face, blonde hair, high forehead, and big eyes all taken care of, you would have to deal with another major aspect of personal presentation, your scent, and in a world without modern deodorant or daily showers, this was a big deal. The medieval person's world was a fragrant one, but not always in a good way. The air was thick with the smells of wood smoke, animal dung, unwashed bodies, and the general miasma of a pre-industrial city. So, the goal wasn't just to smell good, it was often just to mask the bad. The use of strong perfumes and aromatic herbs was a crucial part of a noble person's daily life. It was a way to create a bubble of pleasant scent around yourself, a personal atmosphere that said, "I am a person of refinement and wealth." The perfumes of the time were not the light, floral scents we're used to today. They were often heavy, musky, and intense, made from a combination of natural ingredients and a whole lot of alcohol. These were not spritzed on, they were often dabbed on the skin or worn in a sachet. A popular method was to carry a pomander, a small ball of spices or herbs, often in a decorative container. You would hold it to your nose when a particularly pungent smell wafted your way, which was, often, it was a kind of personal air freshener, a small shield against the odors of the world. The ingredients were varied, but they often included things like civet, a musky secretion from a cat-like animal, ambergris, a substance produced in the digestive system of sperm whales, and various floral oils. These were all incredibly expensive, and their presence on your person was a clear signal that you were a person of means. Now for a quirky tidbit, the use of certain herbs, like lavender and rosemary, wasn't just for their scent, they were also believed to have medicinal properties to ward off disease and evil spirits. The belief was that a pleasant smell could cleanse the air and purify the body, a kind of internal and external hygiene. This is where the line between perfume and medicine becomes incredibly blurred. A whiff of lavender wasn't just a pleasant smell, it was a little bit of protection, a small prayer against the unseen forces of the world. Historians still argue whether the belief in the medicinal properties of these scents was the primary reason for their use, or if it was just a convenient way to justify a luxury item. What is clear is that the sense of smell was a much more important part of daily life than it is for us today. It was a way to navigate a world that was often overwhelming to the senses. It was a way to identify friend from foe, a noble from a peasant, and a healthy person from a sick one. So, as you get ready to drift off to sleep, just remember that the scent you choose to wear is a part of a long and storied tradition, and be glad that you don't have to carry a ball of civet and ambergris around just to get through the day. The perfumes and pomanders of the medieval world weren't just about smelling good, they were also a health risk. While they were meant to mask the bad smells, the very ingredients used to create these fragrant clouds could be incredibly toxic. This is where we get into the perils of perfume. The medieval alchemists and apothecaries, who were often the ones creating these concoctions, had a rudimentary understanding of chemistry. They would mix and match ingredients based on their smell, their colour, or their perceived magical properties, with little to no regard for their long-term health effects. The goal was to create a strong, lasting scent, and they were willing to use some pretty dangerous substances to get it. One of the most common ingredients in medieval perfumes was musk, a substance derived from the glands of a male musk deer. Musk has a deep, animalistic scent that was highly prized, but the process of extracting it was often brutal and cruel. Another popular ingredient was civet, a secretion from the anal glands of the civet cat. These substances, while natural, were often processed with other, more dangerous chemicals. For a quirky tidbit, some recipes called for the use of mercury, a highly toxic heavy metal, to act as a fixative, to help the scent last longer. The belief was that the mercury would fix the scent to the other ingredients, a kind of alchemical magic. Of course, the reality was that it was slowly poisoning the person wearing it. It's a chilling thought. You're trying to smell good, and you're inadvertently giving yourself a dose of mercury poisoning. Historians still argue whether the toxic effects of these perfumes were widely known. While people certainly noticed that their skin was getting irritated or that they were feeling unwell, they often attributed these ailments to other causes. There was no concept of chemical toxicity, so a rash or a headache was just a part of life, a minor inconvenience in the pursuit of beauty. The perfume, in their minds, was a shield, not a weapon. It was a way to ward off disease, to purify the air around them. The irony is that the very thing they were using to protect themselves was slowly harming them. And it wasn't just the ingredients in the perfumes themselves. The containers they were kept in could also be a source of contamination. Some perfumes were kept in lead containers, which would, over time, leach lead into the perfume itself. So, even if the original recipe was relatively safe, the storage could make it deadly. It's a reminder that in the medieval world, even the most mundane parts of life were fraught with hidden dangers. The simple act of putting on a pleasant scent was a roll of the dice, a gamble you took every day. So, as you drift off to sleep, just remember to be thankful for modern, regulated cosmetics and a perfume industry that, for the most part, won't kill you. So far, we've focused almost exclusively on the female beauty standards of the medieval world, but men were just as concerned with their appearance. While their standards were different, they were no less demanding. We'll shift our gaze now to the medieval gentleman and the twin pillars of his style, long hair and brightly coloured hosiery. For a man in the medieval era, hair was a powerful symbol of status and freedom. A nobleman would wear his hair long, often flowing past his shoulders, a style that was meticulously maintained. It was a clear sign that you were a free man, as serfs and peasants were often required to have shorter, more practical haircuts to keep them out of their eyes while working. The long hair was often curled or braided, and it was a source of great pride. It was a look that screamed, "I have a lot of free time and a personal hairstylist." A man's hair was so important that it was often used as a symbol in legal and social rituals. To cut a man's hair against his will was a grave insult, a way of publicly shaming him and stripping him of his masculine identity. Now, for our quirky tidbit. In some parts of Europe, a man's long hair was a sign of his loyalty to his feudal lord. A knight might wear his hair long to show his allegiance to his king, while a rebel or an outlaw might have a shorter, more dishevelled look. It was a subtle but clear way of communicating your political allegiances, a kind of visual shorthand that everyone understood. Historians still argue whether the long hair trend was a direct continuation of the ancient Roman and Germanic traditions of long hair as a sign of virility, or if it was a new ideal that emerged in the medieval period. What we do know is that a man's hair was not just a part of his body, it was a part of his identity. And then there was the hosiery. The medieval knight or nobleman wasn't rocking a pair of plain trousers, he was rocking hose, which were essentially long leggings, and they were often bright and boldly coloured. A man might wear one leg of red hose and one leg of blue, or a striped pattern that was so loud it could be seen from a mile away. This was not a subtle look. This was a look that was meant to be seen. The brightly coloured hose showed off a man's muscular legs, a sign of his physical strength and prowess as a warrior. It was a way of saying, "I'm not just a pretty face, I can also kick some serious butt." The hose was often so tight that it was difficult to put on, and it was a daily struggle for the medieval man to get into his fancy leggings. It was a form of self-torture that was seen as a necessary part of being fashionable. So, as you get ready to drift off, just picture a medieval nobleman with long, flowing hair and bright red and blue leggings. And be glad that your wardrobe choices are a little less, shall we say, flamboyant. While the men of the medieval court were busy with their long hair and colourful hose, they also had to contend with the shifting trends of facial hair. The ideal of a man's appearance was constantly in flux, and nothing was a better indicator of this than the beard. Throughout the medieval period, the beard went in and out of style, and its presence or absence was a powerful social signal. In the early medieval period, a full, well-kept beard was a sign of a man's maturity, wisdom, and virility. It was a mark of a true warrior, a man who was ready to fight and defend his land. But as the centuries wore on, tastes changed, and the clean-shaven look became more popular, especially among the younger noblemen who wanted to project a more youthful, refined image. The decision to wear a beard was a complex one, and it was often influenced by a man's profession, his social status, and his personal beliefs. A knight or a warrior might wear a beard to show off his manliness, while a scholar or a courtier might prefer to be clean-shaven to show off his intellectual pursuits. It was a kind of visual shorthand that told the world who you were and what you stood for. The quirky tidbit for this section is that some legal codes even used the beard as a form of identification. In some places, if you were a man, you could be fined or even arrested for having a beard that was not in line with the current fashion. It's like a medieval version of a fashion police, and they were very serious about it. Historians still argue whether the shifting trends of facial hair were a direct result of changing social attitudes towards masculinity, or if they were simply a matter of personal preference. What we do know is that the beard was not a simple choice. It was a statement, a way of communicating your identity and your place in the world, and it wasn't just about the beard itself. The ideal of a man's body was also a central concern. A man was expected to be brawny, with broad shoulders, a strong torso, and muscular legs. This was not just about aesthetics, it was a matter of survival. A man's body was his primary tool, and a strong, physically fit body was a sign of a man who could defend his family, fight in a war, and work the land. The pursuit of this brawny ideal was a daily struggle, and a man's diet and exercise were a constant concern. A man would train with a sword, ride a horse, and participate in tournaments and hunts, all in the name of building a strong, powerful body. It was a kind of proto-fitness culture, a world where your body was your most valuable asset. So, as you drift off to sleep, just remember that the medieval man's body was a work in progress, a canvas for a whole different set of ideals than our own. And be glad that your workout routine doesn't involve a sword and a suit of armor. Having established the sartorial and physical ideals for both men and women, we'll turn our attention now to a topic that, for the medieval person, was just as much a part of their beauty and social standing as their face powder, cleanliness. But the word cleanliness in the medieval era didn't mean what it does to us today. It wasn't about daily showers and scrubbing with soap. It was about ritual and status, and it varied wildly between social classes. For the aristocracy, cleanliness was a mark of their elevated status, a demonstration of their ability to afford the time, water, and servants needed for more elaborate bathing rituals. These weren't necessarily daily events, mind you, but they were a far cry from the sporadic baths of the common person. A noblewoman might have a bath a few times a month, a luxury that would involve a large wooden tub being filled with heated water, often scented with herbs like rose and lavender. The entire process was a ritual, a social event that might even include her servants and friends. But the quirky tidbit here is that the water itself wasn't always changed between bathers. A family might use the same bath water, with the father going first, followed by the mother, and then the children. A practice that, to our modern sensibilities, seems a little unhygienic. This was a world where water was a precious commodity, and wasting it was seen as a sin. The cleanliness wasn't just about the body, it was also about the soul, and the ritual of bathing was often tied to religious beliefs about purification and piety. Historians still argue whether the less than hygienic practices of the time led to the spread of disease, or if it was simply a matter of a different understanding of germs and sanitation. What we do know is that for the common person, bathing was a much less frequent affair. A peasant might only bathe a few times a year, in a river or a stream, and their clothes would often go unwashed for months at a time. The smell of a medieval city, with its open sewers and crowded living conditions, would have been a shock to our modern noses, but for the people of the time, it was simply the smell of life. So, as you drift off, just remember that a clean body was a luxury, and that for the vast majority of people, a different kind of cleanliness was a far more pressing concern. We've explored the external aspects of beauty, from skin to hosiery, but the medieval person believed that true beauty started on the inside, in the balance of their body's essential components. This brings us to the medical theory of the four humours, a concept that dominated European medicine for over 2,000 years. The four humours, blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, were believed to be the fundamental fluids of the human body. A person's health, temperament, and even their appearance were all thought to be a direct result of the balance, or imbalance, of these four humours. For example, if you had an excess of blood, you were considered to be sanguine, cheerful, optimistic, and ruddy-faced. If you had an excess of phlegm, you were phlegmatic, calm, lethargic, and pale. A person with too much yellow bile was a choleric, hot-tempered, and quick to anger. And a person with too much black bile was a melancholic, sad, introspective, and prone to depression. The ideal was to have a perfect balance of all four, a state that was believed to produce a beautiful, healthy, and well-tempered person. The quirky tidbit for this section is that the colour of your skin was believed to be a direct reflection of your humours. A pale complexion, for example, was a sign of a phlegmatic temperament, while a rosy cheek was a sign of a sanguine one. It was a kind of internal beauty barometer, a way of reading a person's inner state by looking at their outer appearance. Historians still argue whether the humoral theory was a purely medical concept, or if it was also a way of reinforcing social and class distinctions. What we do know is that it had a profound impact on every aspect of a person's life, from their diet to their beauty routines. A person who wanted to be more sanguine, for example, might eat more red meat and drink more wine, while a person who wanted to be more phlegmatic might eat more cold, watery foods. The pursuit of beauty was, in a sense, a medical pursuit, a constant effort to maintain a perfect balance of the four humours. So, as you drift off, just remember that the medieval person's body was a delicate ecosystem, a world of humours that had to be carefully managed to achieve a state of perfect beauty and health. And be glad that you can just go to a doctor instead of a barber surgeon who wants to drain your humours. So, you've got your humours in check. But there was another, far more powerful force at play in the medieval world, the church. The unseen influences of the church on beauty standards were profound and pervasive. In a society where the church was the central authority, dictating everything from what you ate to who you married, it's no surprise that it also had a lot to say about how you should look. The core message was one of modesty and piety. Your physical appearance was a reflection of your inner soul, and a beautiful body was a gift from God. But that gift was meant to be used for pious purposes, not for vanity. The church's teachings created a complex relationship with beauty. On the one hand, a pale, pure complexion and an innocent, wide-eyed gaze could be seen as a reflection of angelic purity, a physical manifestation of a woman's spiritual goodness. On the other hand, the use of makeup, perfume, and elaborate clothing was often condemned as the sin of vanity, a dangerous distraction from the spiritual path. The line between what was considered a God-given beauty and what was a worldly, sinful vanity was incredibly thin, and it was a line that every medieval person had to walk with great care. The clergy, in their sermons and writings, constantly warned against the dangers of pride and the sin of using one's body to entice others. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the hair. While long, flowing hair was a sign of a woman's beauty, it was also seen as a source of temptation. The church, therefore, decreed that married women should cover their hair, a practice that was meant to be a sign of their modesty and submission to their husbands. Unmarried women, however, were often allowed to let their hair down, a visual signal of their availability. This created a situation where a woman's hairstyle was not just a fashion choice, but a public declaration of her marital status and her adherence to the church's teachings. Historians still argue whether the church's emphasis on modesty was a genuine spiritual concern or a form of social control. A way of keeping women in their place. What we do know is that the church had a profound impact on what was considered beautiful, and that for the medieval person, the pursuit of beauty was not just an aesthetic choice, but a spiritual one. So, as you drift off, just remember that in the medieval world, looking good was a lot more complicated than just putting on some makeup. It was a matter of your eternal soul. The quest for the perfect complexion and a youthful glow in the medieval era often led people down some dark and mysterious paths. This brings us to the world of alchemy and the strange, often dangerous cosmetic recipes it produced. Alchemists, a mix of early scientists, magicians, and charlatans, were obsessed with transformation, turning lead into gold, and in this case, turning a common face into a beautiful one. Their laboratories were filled with bubbling pots, strange powders, and bizarre ingredients, all in the name of creating the perfect elixir. And while they never succeeded in turning lead into gold, they did create a whole host of cosmetic remedies that were as fascinating as they were perilous. The most sought-after ingredients for these alchemical cosmetics were often mineral-based. Remember that ceruse we talked about in Section 2? That was an alchemical creation, a mix of lead and vinegar that was believed to be a miracle whitening agent. But alchemists also experimented with other, more exotic substances. For our quirky tidbit, some recipes for face powders called for the use of powdered pearls. The belief was that the pearls, being a symbol of purity and perfection, would impart those same qualities to the skin. It was a kind of sympathetic magic, a world where the properties of an ingredient were believed to be transferred to the person who used it. Historians still argue whether the use of powdered pearls was a widespread practice or a fringe one, but the fact that it was even mentioned in some of the surviving texts on alchemy suggests it was a known, if not popular, option. The process of creating these cosmetics was a secretive one, with alchemists often using cryptic language and symbols to hide their recipes from competitors. It was a world of veiled promises and hidden dangers, where a single miscalculation could lead to a disastrous result. The line between a cosmetic and a poison was incredibly thin, and for many, the risk was worth the reward. The alchemists were, in a sense, the medieval cosmetic chemists, but they were working without any of the safety regulations or scientific understanding that we have today. Their work was based on a mix of tradition, folklore, and a whole lot of trial and error. So, as you drift off, just remember that the next time you put on a face cream, it's a lot less likely to have mercury or lead in it. With all these efforts to achieve a certain look, you might think the medieval person was living in a golden age of self-expression, but there was a constant shadow hanging over all these beauty rituals, the fear of sin. This brings us to a crucial element of the medieval mindset, the mirror, the vanity, and the sin in a deeply religious society. The act of looking at oneself in a mirror with admiration was seen as a dangerous path, a potential gateway to the sin of pride, or superbia. The mirror was not just a tool for self-reflection, it was a symbol of vanity, a physical object that could lead you astray from the path of piety and humility. The Church's teachings were clear on this point. While God had created a beautiful world and beautiful people, the admiration of one's own physical beauty was a form of self-idolatry, a placing of your own worldly appearance above your spiritual well-being. This created a profound moral conflict for the medieval person. On the one hand, there was immense social pressure to conform to the prevailing beauty standards, to be pale, plump, and pious-looking. On the other hand, there was a spiritual danger in caring too much about those very things. The simple act of checking your reflection could be a source of anxiety, a moment of reckoning with your own soul. For our quirky tidbit, some religious texts from the period warned that the devil would appear in the mirror to a vain person, whispering temptations and encouraging them to care more about their appearance than their salvation. It was a kind of spiritual horror story, a way of using fear to keep people on the straight and narrow. The mirror, in this context, wasn't just a piece of glass, it was a kind of spiritual portal, a tool that could be used for good or for evil. Historians still argue whether these warnings were a genuine theological concern or a form of social control, a way of discouraging a rising individualism and consumer culture that threatened the Church's authority. What we do know is that the medieval person's relationship with their own reflection was a lot more complicated and a lot more fraught than our own. So, as you get ready for bed, just remember that for the medieval person, a quick look in the mirror wasn't just a part of their daily routine, It was a moment of moral and spiritual struggle, a constant battle between their worldly desires and their eternal salvation. So you've navigated the spiritual minefield of the mirror, but the medieval world had another surprise in store for you, the art of the blemish. While we tend to think of blemishes, moles, freckles, birthmarks as imperfections to be covered up in the medieval era, they could sometimes be seen as marks of beauty or even piety. This was a world where a person's physical appearance was read like a book, with every detail holding some kind of meaning, from the colour of your hair to the shape of your nose, and sometimes a blemish was a sign that you were special, a person of note. A mole on the cheek, for example, might be seen as a beauty mark, a small dark spot that contrasted with a pale complexion and drew attention to a person's face. It was a kind of natural cosmetic, a little bit of imperfection that made a person all the more beautiful. In some cases, a mole was even believed to be a sign of divine favour, a mark from God that set a person apart from the crowd. For our quirky tidbit, some people would even paint on fake moles, using a small piece of dark fabric or a paste made from soot, in an attempt to mimic this look. It's like a medieval version of a temporary tattoo, a way of getting a little bit of that beauty without having to be born with it. Historians still argue whether this appreciation for blemishes was a genuine aesthetic preference or a way of finding beauty in a world where perfect skin was a rare commodity. What we do know is that the medieval person's relationship with their own body was a lot more complex and a lot less about perfection than our own. They were looking for signs and symbols, for a deeper meaning in every physical feature. A person with a cluster of freckles might be seen as a sun-kissed beauty, a person who spent their days in the natural world, while a person with a birthmark might be seen as a person of great destiny, a person who was born with a mark from God. The blemishes were not seen as flaws to be fixed, they were seen as a part of a person's unique story. So, as you get ready for bed, just remember that the medieval person saw beauty in a lot of places we don't. A blemish wasn't a flaw, it was a feature, it was a part of a person's story, and that's a pretty beautiful way to look at the world, isn't it? While women were busy with their pale complexions and plucked foreheads, men had a completely different set of beauty standards, ones that were forged in the heat of battle and the rough-and-tumble world of medieval society. This brings us to the beauty of a bloody battlefield. In this world, the most attractive feature a man could have wasn't a smooth face or a perfect smile, it was a scar, scars, and the marks of war were seen as symbols of honour, courage, and experience. They were a physical testament to a man's bravery, a map of his past battles and triumphs, a scar on the face, a missing finger, or a limp. These weren't blemishes to be hidden. They were badges of honour, a public declaration that you were a warrior, a man who had faced death and lived to tell the tale. It was a look that communicated strength and resilience, a clear signal that you were a person to be respected and feared. This was a world where a man's value was often measured by his ability to fight, and his scars were his resume. They told a story without a single word, a silent but powerful narrative of a life lived on the edge. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the scar. In some parts of Europe, a man who was wounded in battle was given a small pension or a piece of land, a physical reward for his physical sacrifice. The scar, in this context, wasn't just a mark on the skin, it was a kind of a deed, a title to a piece of land or a stream of income. It was a scar that had a very real, very tangible value. Historians still argue whether the admiration for scars was a genuine aesthetic preference or a way of romanticizing the brutal reality of warfare. What we do know is that a man's body was a canvas for his life story, and his scars were the most important brushstrokes. So, as you get ready for bed, just remember that in the medieval world, a man's face wasn't just a face, it was a record of his life, a testament to his courage and a map of his past. And be glad that your resume doesn't have to be written on your face. While the common person was focused on a pale so healthy complexion, the nobility and the aristocracy had a secret weapon in their beauty arsenal: makeup. This brings us to royal flush, makeup at the court. For a noble woman, makeup was not just a tool for enhancement, it was a form of art, a way to create a specific aesthetic that was both beautiful and powerful. The goal wasn't to look natural, that was for the peasants. The goal was to look like a work of art, a living testament to your family's wealth and your own refined taste. The makeup of the time was, of course, a little different from what we use today. The most popular product was a powder or a paste made from ceruse, that lead-based pigment we talked about in section 2, which was used to create that perfectly pale complexion. But the royal court took it a step further. They would often use a red pigment, usually made from cinnabar, a mineral containing mercury, to colour their cheeks and lips. This was not a subtle, gentle blush. This was a bright, bold, and often garish red that was meant to be seen from across a crowded ballroom. It was a look that screamed, "I am rich, I am powerful, and I can afford to look like this." For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the use of egg whites. Some women would apply a layer of egg white to their face before applying their makeup. The belief was that the egg white would create a smooth, tight surface, a kind of natural primer that would help the makeup stay in place. The reality was that it probably made their skin feel tight and dry, but it was a popular practice nonetheless. Historians still argue whether the use of such a bold, garish look was a conscious choice or a result of the limitations of the available pigments. What we do know is that the royal court was a world of artifice and illusion, where a person's appearance was a carefully constructed mask that hid a whole lot of secrets. So, as you get ready for bed, just remember that the makeup of the medieval court was not about looking natural, it was about looking rich. And that's a kind of beauty that's been in and out of style for centuries. While the noble classes were slathering their faces in ceruse and cinnabar, the common people had a completely different, and arguably healthier, set of beauty standards. This brings us to the peasant's patina. For a peasant or a farmer, a pale complexion was not a sign of beauty, it was a sign of sickness or idleness. The ideal look for a common person was a healthy, sun-kissed look, a face tanned and ruddy from a life of working outdoors. This was a look that communicated strength, vitality, and the ability to work hard. It was a beauty standard based on practicality and survival, not on artifice and leisure. A peasant's beauty was a reflection of their health and their ability to contribute to the family and the community. A ruddy, wind-chapped face and calloused hands were not seen as flaws, they were seen as badges of honor. A public declaration that you were a hard-working person, a person who could be counted on. This was a world where a person's value was often measured by their ability to work the land, and their appearance was a kind of living proof of their worth. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the sun. While a pale complexion was seen as a sign of piety and purity in the noble class, the sun-kissed look of the peasant was also seen as a kind of divine favor. The sun, after all, was God's light, and a person who spent their days bathed in it was, in a sense, a person who was living in the light of God. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine theological belief or a way of finding dignity in a life of hardship. What we do know is that for the peasant, a different kind of beauty was in play, a beauty that was born not in a fancy boudoir, but in the sun-drenched fields of the countryside. So, as you drift off, just remember that beauty standards are a lot like fashion trends. They change with the times. And in the medieval world, a little bit of sun on your face wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. While some beauty practices were seen as a sign of piety or social status, others were viewed with deep suspicion and fear. This brings us to the witch and the wardrobe. In the medieval mind, the line between a folk remedy and a magical spell was incredibly thin. A woman who knew a lot about herbs and their properties, a skill that was often passed down through generations, might be seen as a healer. A wise woman who could cure the sick and beautify the skin. But in a more paranoid or superstitious community, that same woman might be seen as a witch, a person who used her knowledge to cast spells and do the devil's work. This created a dangerous paradox for women who were trying to be beautiful. A woman might use a particular herb to lighten her hair or clear her skin, a practice that she saw as perfectly normal. But if she was accused of witchcraft, that same herb might be used as evidence against her, a sign of her connection to the dark arts. The simple act of creating a cosmetic from a plant could, in the wrong hands, be a death sentence. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the belief that witches used special ointments, often made from Belladonna, remember that from section 5, to fly. The belief was that the ointment would cause hallucinations and a feeling of weightlessness, a sensation that was interpreted as a sign of flight. The Belladonna, which was used for cosmetic purposes, was also seen as a tool of witchcraft. It's a perfect example of how a single substance could be seen in two completely different ways, depending on who was using it. Historians still argue whether the accusations of witchcraft were a result of genuine fear or a way of persecuting women who didn't conform to societal norms. What we do know is that the pursuit of beauty in the medieval world was not always a safe endeavor. It was a world where a woman's knowledge of herbs and medicine could be a source of power, but it could also be a source of great danger. The wardrobe, in this context, wasn't just a place to keep your clothes, it was a place to hide your secrets, to keep your beauty remedies away from prying eyes. We've talked about the ideal of pale, white teeth, but in some cultures, the complete opposite was true. This brings us to the teeth of the serpent. In some parts of the world, particularly in Southeast Asia and parts of Japan, the practice of teeth blackening was a popular and highly sought-after beauty standard. The process, which involved chewing on betel nuts or applying a special lacquer to the teeth, would turn the teeth a deep, glossy black. This wasn't seen as a sign of poor hygiene, it was seen as a mark of high status and beauty. The belief was that black teeth were a sign of a person's refinement, their ability to afford the special materials and the time needed for the process. It was a look that separated the noble from the common, the refined from the unrefined. It was also seen as a sign of a person's purity, as the black teeth were believed to be a reflection of a pure heart and a pure soul. The teeth, in this context, weren't just a part of the mouth, they were a canvas for a whole different kind of beauty. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the serpent. The black teeth were often compared to the scales of a serpent, a symbol of wisdom, power, and immortality. The person with black teeth was, in a sense, a person who had a connection to the mystical and the divine. Historians still argue whether the practice of teeth blackening was a genuine aesthetic preference or a way of creating a visual distinction between social classes. What we do know is that it was a deeply ingrained cultural practice that lasted for centuries. It was a world where a perfect smile was not a set of pearly whites, but a set of gleaming black teeth. And that's a kind of beauty that's so different from our own that it feels like it belongs to a whole different planet. We've discussed the importance of a pale complexion as a sign of wealth and leisure. But let's dig deeper into the direct connection between food, diet, and physical appearance. This brings us to a feast for the eyes. In the medieval world, your body was a living, breathing testament to your social status, and nothing said, "I'm rich," more clearly than a well-fed, plump physique. This wasn't just about looking good, it was about survival. A person who had access to a steady stream of meat, fine breads, and sweet wine was a person who was not only wealthy, but also healthy. They were less likely to succumb to the various diseases and ailments that plagued the poor, and their robust appearance was a clear signal of their vitality. The link between food and a pale complexion was also direct. For the peasant, a life of toil in the sun meant a dark, ruddy face. For the noble, a life of indoor pursuits meant a pale, unblemished face. It was a kind of natural skin lightening, a side effect of a life of leisure. The food they ate also contributed to this look. A nobleman's diet, rich in fat and protein, was believed to produce a more refined and pure blood, which in turn would lead to a more beautiful complexion. The peasant's diet, on the other hand, was often based on grains and vegetables, a diet that was believed to produce a coarser and darker blood. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the belief that a woman's beauty could be enhanced by eating certain foods. A woman who wanted to have a pale complexion might eat more foods that were believed to be cold and wet, like cucumbers and melons, while a woman who wanted to have a rosy cheek might eat more foods that were believed to be hot and dry, like spices and red meat. It was a kind of medieval food as medicine, a world where your diet was a part of your beauty routine. Historians still argue whether these beliefs had any real basis in reality or if they were just a form of superstition. What we do know is that for the medieval person, food was not just a source of nourishment, it was a tool for self-creation. While a plump physique was the ideal during times of plenty, beauty standards could shift dramatically during times of hardship. This brings us to the fashions of the famine. During periods of scarcity, like a widespread crop failure or a prolonged siege, the beauty ideal of a well-fed person took on an even greater significance. A plump body was no longer just a sign of wealth, it was a sign of survival. A person who was able to maintain their weight and health during a famine was seen as a person of immense resilience, a person who was favored by God or who had a secret source of food. It was a kind of living proof that you were a person of note, a person who had managed to escape the worst of the suffering. The fashion of the time also reflected this. Clothing became looser and more voluminous, a style that could hide a person's gauntness and create the illusion of a fuller figure. Women might wear more layers of fabric, and men might wear padded tunics, all in an effort to maintain the illusion of health and prosperity. It was a kind of sartorial survival mechanism, a way of using clothes to hide the brutal reality of a world without food. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the hollow eye. During a famine, a person's eyes would often sink into their sockets, a physical sign of malnutrition. To combat this, some people would use a dark coal or a paste made from soot to create the illusion of a larger, more luminous eye, a kind of fake vitality that was meant to hide the truth. It was a desperate act of beauty in a world that was anything but. Historians still argue whether the fashions of the famine were a conscious effort to deceive or a simple reflection of a cultural ideal that became even more important during times of hardship. What we do know is that a person's appearance was a powerful and public symbol of their status, and during a famine, that symbol was more important than ever. We've spent a lot of time on the visible aspects of beauty. But in the medieval world, beauty could also be a matter of perception, of the spirit rather than the flesh. This brings us to the beauty of the blind. In a world where a person's physical appearance was so important, a person who was blind was often seen in a completely different light. Their lack of sight was sometimes associated with a kind of spiritual insight, a heightened sense of perception that allowed them to see things that a sighted person could not. It was a kind of paradox. A person who was physically without sight was seen as having a deeper, more profound kind of vision. The blind person was often seen as a prophet, a seer, a person who had a direct connection to the divine. Their lack of sight was seen as a kind of divine trade-off. They had lost one sense, but in return, they had gained another, a spiritual sense that allowed them to perceive the true nature of the world. This is where the line between a physical disability and a spiritual gift becomes incredibly blurred. A blind person wasn't just a person who couldn't see, they were a person who had a kind of holy power. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the inner eye. The blind person was often depicted in art and literature with a kind of serene, otherworldly look, a kind of internal gaze that was meant to convey their deep spiritual wisdom. It was a beauty standard that had nothing to do with physical perfection and everything to do with spiritual depth. Historians still argue whether this romanticization of blindness was a genuine belief or a way of finding dignity for a marginalized group. What we do know is that it was a deeply ingrained cultural belief, a world where a physical flaw could be seen as a spiritual gift. So, as you drift off, just remember that in the medieval world, beauty could be found in the most unexpected places. As we've seen, the medieval world had a unique perspective on adult beauty. But what about children? This brings us to the surprising medieval standards for children, which were a radical departure from our modern sensibilities. Today, we celebrate childhood as a distinct and unique phase of life, with its own fashions and ideals. But in the medieval era, children were often seen as miniature adults. The ideal was not a child with a playful, innocent look. It was a child who looked like a small, dignified adult. This was a world where a child's value was often measured by their ability to contribute to the family, and their appearance was a reflection of that. Children were often dressed in smaller versions of adult clothing, with no special consideration for their age or their need to play. A child might be wearing a miniature version of a tight-fitting tunic or a long, flowing gown, a look that was both impractical and uncomfortable. The goal was to train the child to be a respectable adult, and their clothing was a part of that training. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the small old man. In some medieval art, children are depicted with the features of a small old man, a receding hairline, a serious expression, and a kind of world-weary look in their eyes. This wasn't a mistake by the artist, it was a conscious choice, a way of conveying the idea that a child was not just a child, but a person with a soul and a purpose. Historians still argue whether the medieval people's perception of children was a result of a lack of understanding of child development or a practical necessity in a world where childhood was a brief and dangerous period of life. What we do know is that a child's appearance was a powerful and public symbol of their future, and that for the medieval person, a child was not just a child, but a small, dignified adult in the making. Having explored the standards for children, we now return to the adults and a feature that was not just about aesthetics, but about power, status, and identity: hair. This brings us to the power of the poetic hairline. For a man, his hair was a direct reflection of his social standing. As we discussed earlier, long, flowing hair was a sign of a free man, a nobleman who didn't have to toil in the fields. But the length and style of that hair were also a kind of code, a visual language that everyone understood. A man's hair could be a sign of his age, his marital status, and his profession. A young, unmarried man might wear his hair loose and flowing, a symbol of his youthful vigor and his freedom. A married man, on the other hand, might wear his hair tied back or braided, a symbol of his responsibility and his commitment to his family. A man who was a scholar or a cleric might have a tonsure, a shaved spot on the top of his head, a symbol of his devotion to God and his rejection of worldly vanity. The hairline, in this context, wasn't just a part of the head, it was a kind of a visual resume, a public declaration of a man's life story. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the hair of the king. In some parts of Europe, the king's long, flowing hair was seen as a symbol of his divine right to rule. It was a kind of a physical manifestation of his power, a living testament to his connection to God. The act of cutting a king's hair was seen as a grave insult, a symbolic act of dethroning him. Historians still argue whether this belief was a genuine cultural norm or a way of reinforcing the power of the monarchy. What we do know is that a man's hair was a lot more than just hair. It was a part of his identity, his power, and his place in the world. The medieval world's obsession with beauty and fashion wasn't just a matter of personal preference, it was also a reflection of global trade and the brutal realities that came with it. This brings us to the unseen scars of the silk trade. While the nobility of Europe were wearing rich, flowing silks, they were often completely unaware of the human cost that went into creating those luxurious fabrics. The silk trade, which originated in China, was a dangerous and arduous journey that involved caravans traveling thousands of miles across deserts and mountains. The people who worked on these caravans, the merchants and the guards, often risked their lives for a chance at a profit. The silk itself was a kind of a living testament to that hardship, a fabric that had traveled across a world of danger and death to arrive in the hands of a European noblewoman. The dyes used to color these fabrics were also a part of this story. While a nobleman's tunic might be a vibrant red or a deep blue, those colors were often created with pigments that were sourced from all over the world, often in brutal and dangerous conditions. A red dye might come from the crushed bodies of cochineal insects in Mexico, a deep blue might come from indigo plants in India, and a bright yellow might come from saffron in Persia. These pigments, like the silk itself, were a kind of a living testament to a world of global trade, a world of hardship and exploitation that was hidden behind the beautiful facade of a noble's wardrobe. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the silk itself. The silk, with its smooth, delicate texture, was often seen as a symbol of a woman's purity and her elevated status. The fact that it was made by a silkworm, a creature that was seen as a symbol of transformation and rebirth, only added to its allure. Historians still argue whether the European nobility were aware of the brutal realities of the silk trade, or if they were simply so enamored with the finished product that they chose to ignore its origins. What we do know is that a person's wardrobe in the medieval era wasn't just a matter of personal taste, it was a kind of a living history book, a story of global trade, hardship, and beauty that was woven into every thread. The pursuit of beauty wasn't just for the secular world. Even within the walls of a monastery or a convent, there were strict rules about a person's appearance. This brings us to the monk, the nun, and the main. For those who chose a life of religious devotion, a person's physical appearance was a direct reflection of their spiritual commitment. The goal wasn't to look beautiful in a worldly sense, but to look pious and humble, to reject the vanity of the world in favor of a life of prayer and contemplation. The most visible sign of this rejection of vanity was the haircut. For monks, the most common style was the tonsure, a shaved spot on the top of the head that was meant to symbolize the crown of thorns worn by Jesus. It was a kind of a living prayer, a daily reminder of the suffering of Christ. For nuns, the most common practice was to have their hair cut short or to have it completely covered by a wimple, a cloth that was wrapped around the head and neck. This was a way of symbolically marrying themselves to God, of rejecting the worldly allure of their hair. The hair, in this context, wasn't just a part of the body, it was a kind of a spiritual banner, a sign of a person's devotion to God. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the wimple. The wimple, with its tight-fitting cloth and its complete covering of the hair, was often seen as a symbol of a woman's modesty and her spiritual purity. It was a kind of a physical shield against the temptations of the world, a garment that was meant to keep a woman's eyes and ears focused on God. Historians still argue whether the strict grooming and beauty rules for those in religious orders were a genuine spiritual concern or a way of enforcing a kind of social control, a way of keeping the clergy in their place. What we do know is that a person's appearance, even in a monastery or a convent, was a powerful and public symbol of their spiritual commitment. So, as you get ready for bed, just remember that even in the most pious of places, a person's appearance was a matter of great concern. We've talked about the toxic and dangerous ingredients used in cosmetics, but in the medieval world, there was another, far more natural approach to beauty. This brings us to the healing touch of herbalism. For the vast majority of people, a trip to the doctor or a barber surgeon was a luxury they couldn't afford. So, they relied on the knowledge of folk healers and wise women who had a deep and intimate understanding of the plants and herbs that grew around them. These women would create a whole host of herbal remedies for skincare, hair treatments, and other beauty practices, a world of natural medicine that was passed down through generations. A person with acne, for example, might be given a poultice made from honey and oats, a remedy that was believed to have anti-inflammatory and antiseptic properties. A person who wanted to have a clearer complexion might be given a tea made from chamomile or calendula, herbs that were believed to have a soothing and purifying effect on the skin. And a person who wanted to have shinier hair might be given a rinse made from nettle or rosemary, herbs that were believed to have a strengthening and conditioning effect. It was a kind of a natural pharmacy, a world where the plants around you were your best and most trusted source of medicine and beauty. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the rose. The rose, with its soft petals and its sweet scent, was often used in cosmetic remedies for women. The belief was that the rose, being a symbol of love and beauty, would impart those same qualities to the person who used it. Historians still argue whether the use of these herbal remedies was a genuine form of medicine or a kind of a placebo effect, a psychological trick that made people feel better without having any real physical effect. What we do know is that herbalism was a crucial part of the medieval person's life, a world where the beauty of a plant was not just a pleasure to behold, but a source of healing and strength. As we've seen, the medieval world was a place where beauty was often tied to the natural and the divine. But there was another, far stranger source of inspiration for beauty standards, the mythical creatures of medieval folklore. This brings us to the beauty of the bizarre beast. Medieval bestiaries, illustrated manuscripts that described real and mythical animals, were incredibly popular, and the creatures within them, from the majestic griffin to the fearsome dragon, often found their way into the human world of beauty and fashion. The griffin, for example, a creature with the head and wings of an eagle and the body of a lion, was a symbol of strength and nobility. A woman who wanted to be seen as a person of great power might wear a headdress with feathers or a gown with a lion-like pattern, a kind of a sartorial homage to the beast, the unicorn. A creature of purity and innocence, was also a popular source of inspiration. A woman who wanted to be seen as chaste and virtuous might wear a gown of pure white, a colour that was associated with the mythical beast. The symbolism of these creatures was so powerful that it could be used to communicate a person's inner qualities without a single word. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the dragon. The dragon, a creature of immense power and danger, was a popular symbol in medieval art and folklore. A man who wanted to be seen as a brave and fearless warrior might wear a tunic with a dragon on it, a kind of a visual declaration of his courage. Historians still argue whether the use of these mythical creatures in beauty and fashion was a genuine belief in their power or a way of using popular folklore to create a unique and memorable look. What we do know is that the medieval world was a place where the line between reality and mythology was incredibly blurred, and where the beauty of a bizarre beast could be used to create a truly beautiful human. We've talked about the strange beauty standards of the medieval era, but a person's body was only half the story. The clothing they wore was just as important, if not more so. This brings us to the dance of the drapery. In the medieval world, clothing was not just about covering the body, it was about creating a specific aesthetic, a kind of living sculpture that communicated a person's social status, their wealth, and their identity. The way a piece of fabric was draped, folded, and cinched was a matter of great importance. For a woman, the ideal was often a long, flowing gown that was cinched just under the bust, creating a high-waisted silhouette that emphasized a full figure. The fabric would fall in soft, graceful folds, a kind of a living waterfall of cloth. This wasn't just about looking good, it was about looking like you had a lot of fabric, a clear signal that you were a person of means. For a man, the ideal was often a tight-fitting tunic that showed off his muscular torso and broad shoulders. The tunic might be cinched with a belt, a kind of a visual declaration of a man's strength and his readiness for battle. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the train. The train, a long piece of fabric that trailed behind a woman's dress, was a symbol of her wealth and her status. The longer the train, the more important she was. It was a kind of a visual peacock's tail, a way of showing off a person's power and their ability to afford a servant to carry their train. Historians still argue whether the length of a train was a genuine indicator of a woman's social status or a form of social climbing, a way of faking it until you made it. What we do know is that a person's clothing was a lot more than just a piece of fabric. It was a kind of a living history book, a story of wealth, power, and identity that was woven into every thread, with the body and clothing perfected. The final touch for the medieval noblewoman was often a splash of colour on the lips and cheeks. This brings us to the price of a perfect pout. The use of pigments to colour the face was a common practice, a way of adding a touch of vitality and youth to a pale, porcelain complexion. But as we've seen with other medieval beauty practices, the ingredients used were often incredibly toxic and dangerous, a kind of beauty that came with a hefty, and often deadly, price tag. The most popular colour for the cheeks and lips was a vibrant red, a colour that was associated with youth, health, and vitality. To get this colour, a woman might use a pigment made from cinnabar, a mineral containing mercury. This was not a subtle, natural-looking blush. This was a bold, bright, and often garish red that was meant to be seen from a mile away. The mercury in the cinnabar, of course, was a slow-acting poison, and its use could lead to a whole host of health problems, from tremors and memory loss to skin lesions and even death. It's like a medieval version of a makeup that slowly but surely eats away at your body. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the use of a pigment made from the bodies of cochineal insects. The insects, which were native to Mexico, would be crushed and ground into a fine powder, which would then be mixed with a liquid to create a vibrant red paste. This was a much safer alternative to cinnabar, but it was also incredibly expensive. A clear sign that a woman who could afford to colour her lips with cochineal was a person of immense wealth and status. Historians still argue whether the use of these toxic pigments was a result of a lack of knowledge or a kind of a reckless disregard for one's own health in the name of beauty. What we do know is that for the medieval person, a perfect pout was a lot more than just a matter of personal taste. It was a matter of life and death. While the medieval world had a clear and often rigid set of beauty standards, there was also a fascinating counter-narrative, the art of the ugly. In a world obsessed with physical perfection, certain physical deformities or features were sometimes seen as marks of divine favour or spiritual depth. A person with a limp, a hunchback, or a crooked nose wasn't necessarily seen as a person to be pitied. They were sometimes seen as a person who had a special connection to God, a person who had been marked by a kind of spiritual fire. This was a world where a person's physical appearance was not just a matter of aesthetics, it was a matter of their eternal soul. The belief was that a person who was physically imperfect was, in a sense, a person who had been chosen by God to bear a kind of spiritual cross. Their physical deformity was a constant reminder of their mortality and their dependence on God. a kind of a living prayer. It was a kind of a paradox. A person who was physically flawed was, in a sense, a person who was spiritually perfect. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the hunchback. In some parts of Europe, a person with a hunchback was seen as a person of great wisdom and spiritual insight, a person who had a direct connection to the divine. The hunchback, in this context, wasn't a flaw. It was a kind of a spiritual badge, a physical sign of a person's inner goodness. Historians still argue whether the romanticization of physical deformities was a genuine belief or a way of finding dignity for a marginalized group. What we do know is that it was a deeply ingrained cultural belief, a world where a physical flaw could be seen as a spiritual gift. So, as you get ready for bed, just remember that in the medieval world, beauty could be found in the most unexpected places. We've talked about the toxic pigments and the herbal remedies, but for the most wealthy and powerful people, there was a whole other level of beauty and fashion, the use of precious metals. This brings us to the shimmer of silver and gold. In the medieval world, gold and silver were not just a form of currency, they were a form of art, a way of showing off a person's immense wealth and power. And for the most elite, this extended to their cosmetics and their wardrobe. A noblewoman might use a powder made from finely ground silver or gold to add a subtle shimmer to her skin, a kind of a medieval highlighter that was both beautiful and incredibly expensive. The belief was that the gold, being a symbol of divine light and perfection, would impart those same qualities to the person who used it. It was a kind of a living, breathing work of art, a person who was literally shimmering with wealth and power. The same went for clothing. A nobleman might have a tunic embroidered with gold or silver thread, a garment that was so heavy and so expensive that it was a kind of a wearable bank account. The shimmer of the gold and silver wasn't just a matter of aesthetics, it was a matter of a person's financial worth. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the gold tooth. In some parts of Europe, a person who had a gold tooth was seen as a person of immense wealth and status. It was a kind of a permanent piece of jewelry, a kind of a visual declaration of a person's fortune. Historians still argue whether the use of gold and silver in beauty and fashion was a genuine aesthetic preference or a form of conspicuous consumption, a way of showing off one's wealth in a world where it was a matter of great importance. What we do know is that a person's appearance was a lot more than just a matter of personal taste. It was a matter of their financial worth. We've discussed the use of makeup, herbs, and precious metals, but some of the most bizarre beauty practices were rooted in the medical theories of the time. This brings us to the lasting legacy of Witchcraft, the medical practice of bloodletting, which was based on the Humoral theory we talked about in section 14, was not just used for treating diseases, it was also used for cosmetic reasons. The belief was that by draining some of the bad blood from a person's body, their complexion would become clearer, their skin would become healthier, and their overall appearance would improve. It was a kind of a medical facial, a way of using a painful and often dangerous procedure to achieve a state of beauty. The process was simple. A barber surgeon would apply a small, blood-sucking leech to a person's skin, usually on the face or the neck. The leech would then attach itself and begin to suck the blood, a process that was believed to be purifying the body. The patient would sit there, often for hours, with a leech on their face, all in the name of beauty. The belief was that the leech was drawing out the bad humours, the toxins, and the impurities that were causing a person's skin to look dull or unhealthy. It was a kind of a spiritual and physical cleanse, a way of using a strange and slimy creature to achieve a state of perfect beauty. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the leech. The leech, a creature that was often seen as a symbol of greed and gluttony, was in this context a kind of a spiritual healer, a creature that was used to draw out a person's inner impurities. Historians still argue whether the practice of bloodletting had any real physical effect or if it was just a kind of a placebo effect, a psychological trick that made people feel better without having any real physical effect. What we do know is that it was a deeply ingrained cultural belief, a world where a person's appearance was not just a matter of cosmetics, but a matter of their internal health. While the medieval nobility were using precious metals and leeches for beauty, they were also dealing with a much more mundane and often disgusting problem, the folly of the flea. In a world without modern sanitation or insect control, fleas were a constant and unwelcome guest. They were everywhere, from the straw on the floors to the fur on a person's clothes, and for the nobility, who were often wearing heavy, multi-layered garments made from fur, the problem was even worse. The fur was a perfect breeding ground for fleas, and the nobles, in their pursuit of beauty and fashion, were unknowingly carrying a whole colony of pests with them wherever they went. The most popular solution to this problem was a strange and often comical one, the flea fur. This was a small piece of fur, often from an ermine or a sable, that a woman would carry around with her. The belief was that the flea, being a creature of a warmer climate, would be attracted to the fur and would jump off the person's body and onto the flea fur. It was a kind of a medieval insect trap, a way of using a small piece of fur to keep the fleas at bay. The flea fur was often a beautiful and expensive accessory, a small piece of a larger puzzle of beauty and hygiene. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the flea. The flea, a creature that was often seen as a symbol of filth and disease, was in this context a kind of a living reminder of a person's mortality and their connection to the natural world. Historians still argue whether the flea fur was a genuine solution to the flea problem or a kind of a psychological crutch, a way of making a person feel like they were doing something to combat the problem. What we do know is that a person's wardrobe in the medieval era was a lot more than just a matter of personal taste. It was a matter of their hygiene and their survival. As we've seen, the medieval world had a complicated relationship with cleanliness, but there was one place where hygiene was a public and social affair: the quiet revolution of the bathhouse. While private baths were a luxury for the wealthy, public bathhouses were a common feature of medieval cities. These were not just places for washing, they were social hubs, places where people could relax, gossip, and even conduct business. The bathhouse was a kind of a medieval spa, a place where a person could escape the grime and the stress of daily life and emerge feeling refreshed and rejuvenated. The bathhouses were often a mix of hot and cold baths, with people moving from one to the other. A kind of a medieval hydrotherapy. The water was often scented with herbs and flowers, and the air was thick with the smell of steam and soap. The bathhouses were also a place of social mixing, where people from different social classes could interact in a way that was not possible in other parts of society. The bathhouse was a kind of a social equalizer, a place where a person's social status was, for a moment, washed away. For our quirky tidbit, let's talk about the symbolism of the public bath. The public bath was often seen as a symbol of a city's health and its prosperity. A city with a well-maintained and well-used public bath was seen as a city that was both clean and prosperous. Historians still argue whether the decline of the public bathhouse in the later medieval period was a result of a changing attitude towards hygiene or a fear of the spread of disease. What we do know is that the public bathhouse was a crucial part of medieval life, a place where a person's appearance was not just a matter of personal taste, but a matter of public health. We have journeyed through a world of strange and often dangerous beauty standards, from the pale skin of the noblewoman to the sun-kissed face of the peasant, from the toxic pigments of the royal court to the healing herbs of the wise woman. We have seen how beauty was not just a matter of personal taste, but a matter of social status, of religious belief, and of survival. We have seen how a person's appearance was a kind of a living history book, a story of wealth, power, and identity that was written on their face, their body, and their clothes. And as we reach the end of our journey, we can see a clear and undeniable truth, the timeless echo of vanity, for all their strangeness, for all their bizarre and dangerous practices. The medieval beauty standards are not so different from our own. We, too, are obsessed with a certain look, whether it's a perfectly sculpted body, a flawless complexion, or a face that has been carefully crafted with makeup and surgery. We, too, are willing to go to great lengths to achieve that look, whether it's a toxic diet, a painful workout routine, or a cosmetic procedure that comes with a hefty price tag. We, too, are using our appearance to communicate our social status, our wealth, and our identity. We are, in a sense, a living, breathing testament to a timeless truth that the desire to be beautiful is a fundamental part of the human experience. Historians still argue whether our modern beauty standards are a direct continuation of the medieval ones or a completely new phenomenon. What we do know is that the echoes of the medieval world are all around us. The desire for a plump, healthy body is still a part of some cultures. The use of herbs and natural remedies is a booming industry, and the fear of vanity is still a part of our spiritual and moral landscape. So, as you get ready to drift off, just remember that the pursuit of beauty is a long and storied tradition, a journey that has taken us from the lead-based powders of the medieval court to the Instagram filters of the modern world. And in the end, it's all just a different way of doing the same thing, trying to feel a little bit more beautiful in a world that can be a little bit ugly. The journey is now complete. The world of medieval beauty, with all its strangeness and all its danger, is now a part of your consciousness, a little bit of history that you can carry with you into your dreams. The flicker of the candle has grown dim, the scent of the wood smoke has faded, and the sounds of the medieval world have grown soft and distant. The past is now a memory, a story that has been told. You are safe now, and the world is still and quiet. Let yourself sink into the comfort of your bed, the softness of your sheets, and the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. The day is done, the world is asleep, and it is time for you to do the same. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.